Yeah, I just wanted to compare a couple of methods that we've been talking about for estimating the change in energy from wind farm flow control. I'm presenting this, and Paul Fleming from NREL helped a lot with the code implementation and coming up with a lot of these ideas. So we've implemented these methods in the FLASC open source software, which I'll talk about in more detail later. I just wanted to talk about the outline real quick. So I'll be demonstrating these methods using the SMARTEOLE wake steering experiment data set that most of us are familiar with, and we've talked about in this work package before. And then talk about two methods: the power ratio method for estimating the change in energy from wind farm flow control. This we had implemented this in FLASC a long time ago, and then just in December we implemented a method that's based on the method that's documented in the TNO report, which we're calling the expected power method. And a little bit about the implementation in FLASC and how to run these methods. And then we'll compare the change in energy and uncertainty for the two approaches. If you have any questions, feel free to jump in. Just maybe raise your hand, or just let me know if you have a comment or question. All right, so I thought I would just give an overview of the SMARTEOLE experiment. I did present on this a few years ago. So some of this is just a review of what I presented earlier. This was a collaboration with NG Green at a wind farm in France with 7 turbines, and we applied yaw misalignments, so implemented wake steering on one of the turbines called SMV6, and that was to deflect its wake away from SMV5 about 3.7 rotor diameters downstream in the direction of 208 degrees, I believe. And so we were just focusing on trying to maximize the power of that pair of turbines. So the experiment ran from February to May, so relatively short experiment, but given the prevailing wind direction at the site, we did capture a lot of data. And so this is documented in this wind energy science paper, and we're focusing on this experiment right now because this data is publicly available. It was made available by NG, so it's just easy to work with that and show examples, show results using that data. So we applied positive yaw misalignments, so a counterclockwise rotation, show it here, counterclockwise rotation of the nacelle of the turbine when viewing from above to deflect the wake away from the downstream turbine. And that was applied over about a 25-degree sector. And as the wind speed increased, then the offsets were scaled until they were reduced to 0 for wind speeds above 14 meters per second, roughly the rated wind speed for this turbine. And just showing the long-term windrows at the site. So yeah, really the prevailing wind direction is southwest, so aligned with our pair of turbines we're focusing on. So we're able to collect a lot of data when the downstream turbine was waked by our wake steering turbine. So for most of the analysis of this, we focused on these 2 turbines, the upstream and downstream turbine. We called those our test turbines, and then we had 4 other turbines we used as references, which are circled in blue on this map. And for the reference turbines, we took the average of their wind directions, used that as the wind direction reference, and then the average of their wind speeds, use that as the wind speed reference for binning the data. And then came up, for some of the analysis for the power ratio method, we came up with or derived a test power signal, which was just the average power of the test turbines, of the two turbines, and then a reference power, so the average power of the four reference turbines. So we use these in the power ratio method for quantifying the change in energy. So just wanted to define these terms here. So during the experiment, the controller toggled hourly between baseline and wake steering control, and then we just focused on wind directions from 195 to 241 degrees and wind speeds from 4 meters per second to 17 meters per second. So then we resampled the data to 1 minute averages of our power and wind speed, the variables we were interested in, and then filtered for normal operation for all the reference and test turbines. So if any turbines were derated, curtailed, not operating for some reason, then we removed that timestamp. So for each 1 minute sample, all of the test and reference turbines were operating normally. And that resulted in about 10,000 1 minute samples during baseline control, and then 10,000 during wake steering control. About 7 days in each category of combined 1 minute samples. Of course, that spanned about a 3-month period, so there were a lot of gaps in the data. And just showing that there was a pretty even representation of the wind speeds and wind directions and turbulence intensities for the two control modes. All right, so now talking about estimating the change in energy between the wake steering and baseline control periods using what I'll call the power ratio method. And this is where we, so bin our 1 minute data by the reference wind speed and direction. Typically use 1 meter per second wind speed bins and maybe 2 degree wind direction bins. Could also bin by other variables like turbulence intensity, but for this we just used the wind speed and direction. So then we come up with these power ratios, which is the ratio between the power of the test turbines, the average power of the test turbines, and the average power of the reference turbines during the baseline and wake steering control periods. And we come up with a power ratio for each wind condition bin, which is indicated by the index I here. Then for each bin, we can compute the change in the power ratio, which is just the difference between the power ratio during wake steering control and baseline control. And we could come up with the single metric that we're most interested in, which is the percent change in energy during the experiment based on the change in power ratio for each wind condition bin. And this says percent AEP gain, but really it could just be percent energy gain during whatever period we're interested in. So in the numerator, we're summing over all wind condition bins the frequency of occurrence of that wind condition, and then the change multiplied by the change in the power ratio, how much the power ratio changed when we have wake steering control compared to baseline control. And then since that's just a ratio, then we multiply that by the average power of the reference turbines to get a power value. So that the numerator then will be the change in power summed over all wind condition bins, and then the denominator is just going to be the power produced during baseline control periods. And then from that, we get a percent increase or potentially percent decrease, depending on how the experiment goes. And then these frequencies, bin frequencies F, they can be long-term frequencies determined from a long-term windrows, or just the frequencies based on the data collected during the experiment. So for the results here, just using the data, the frequencies during the experiment period. Okay, so that's how we estimate the increase in energy or the change in energy. To quantify the uncertainty, this approach uses bootstrapping. So this is where we take our data sets for the baseline and wake steering control periods, and then randomly resample them with replacement many times, n times, typically over 1,000 iterations. Each time we resample the data, we'll estimate a new change in energy using that resampled data, and then we'll end up with a distribution of thousands of values of the change in energy. From that, we can determine confidence intervals or whatever metric we want to use for uncertainty quantification, but typically we've just been using the 95% confidence interval. And on the right, this is just illustrating what this bootstrapping looks like, what the random resampling with replacement looks like. So say for the baseline data, we have 10 samples, and just with indices from 0 to 9. Then from our n bootstrap samples, we would randomly resample this data with replacement. So we'll get, a kind of a random order. We can have certain indices repeating multiple times because we're resampling with replacement. And so these new bootstrap samples are intended to represent if we were to obtain a new sample from our population of data. Dan, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, just a quick one. Is this applied, I guess, bin-wise, or is it done after sort of you've combined things into a single metric like the AEP? Where is this applied?
Yeah, so the random resampling, this is applied kind of at the earliest stages of the calculation. So before there's any binning applied, before we're computing these metrics. So it's just kind of providing a brand new set of data to the algorithm each iteration.
So what's an example of a quantity that you compute with the bootstrap?
So yeah, going back to the last slide, this total change in energy. So we would compute the power ratios for the baseline and control periods using the resampled data each iteration.
Okay, and but the I is the bins. So is there a? I guess what I'm getting at. Sorry, let me be clear. Mostly, I'm wondering if you have any checks on like how much data you have, if it is bin-wise or wherever you do it, that you have enough samples to have like a robust bootstrapping, and what number you use to determine that.
Right. So there are no checks on how much data ends up in a particular bin. So you could have one bootstrap iteration, you resample the data. Maybe there's no data for a particular wind speed bin or a particular wind speed wind direction bin, if that's a less common wind condition. And then other times that you might have 10 samples in that bin. So so you do get this you get different distributions of data in your reconditioned bins each iteration. And there's no checks to say that you only have one sample in a particular bin. That just ends up showing up in the total change in energy that's computed.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And not saying this is the single correct way to do this. It's just we thought about whether to apply bootstrapping at the bin level or at the very beginning before the data are binned, and we just settled on kind of doing the random resampling at the earliest stage possible when computing the change in energy. Brian, you have a comment, question?
Hey, yeah, I was just curious, since you're doing toggle testing here, if this was a kind of standard bootstrap, or if you guys were doing block bootstrapping to make sure that you have like the same number of toggle periods between each sample, or the same number of like diurnal cycles, if you're taking that temporal correlation into account with this bootstrapping method.
Right. Yeah, so we do have that capability, and I have some results for different amounts, like different block sizes. And yeah, so actually this next slide,
oh, great.
I added some color to the slide here, and yeah, just kind of illustrated block bootstrapping, which is relatively new to me. I've certainly been familiar with this concept for a while, but haven't really used it or investigated it too much. But yeah, as this method is implemented in FLASC, there's a block bootstrapping approach. So this is where I should say, like the standard bootstrapping, you're assuming that the samples are independent, identically distributed, so not accounting for any correlation between different indices in the time series. So block bootstrapping does account for temporal correlation of the data. It at least tries to correct for that. And so an example of this would be, like you said, a diurnal cycle. So the power at 1 minute is going to be highly correlated to the power the next minute, and maybe for the next couple hours. Yeah, depending on the wind conditions at the site. So if we just randomly resample each 1 minute period independently, that can hide some of the temporal correlation that could affect the uncertainty. So block bootstrapping, we group our time series data into blocks. And so that's illustrated by this top row on the right side, where our 10 samples are grouped into blocks of size 2. And so we end up with 5 different blocks indicated by the different colors. And then when we randomly resample with replacement, then we're randomly resampling the different blocks. So we're always going to have the same order, or the same pair of samples next to each other within a block. So this is just showing 3 realizations of what that random resampling could look like when we keep the blocks together. Irina?
Yes, maybe this is a stupid question, but I'm not very familiar with this technique. Why the order of the samples makes a difference? This is something I don't really get. If we are always using the same sample, not changing the sample we have made, or I mean, maybe I'm losing something, but.
Oh, just like why would it matter to keep
the order in
the
itself,
blocks together?
Yeah, the order in itself. Why this matters? If we are afterwards making an aggregate per bin.
Right. Yeah, so I don't know for the change in energy computation, I don't think it would. Yeah, it wouldn't matter what order the samples are within a block. So I think like for this second block, the red block, it could be 3 and then 2, and that wouldn't affect our results. I think the idea is just to keep those, like always keep those samples together, so they're included at the same time when we're computing the change in energy, just because in reality there would be that temporal correlation. So we would we would likely end up with multiple samples that are highly correlated because of they occur near the same time.
Okay.
And yeah, I should also say that I don't fully understand the theory behind the block bootstrapping and how that how that improves the uncertainty estimate by accounting for temporal correlation. So this is relatively new to me. Yeah, I'm still trying to learn and understand. So if anybody has anything to share about block bootstrapping, that would be helpful.
I don't know if this is exactly right. I'm fairly new to it too, but so the way I think about it is like at one extreme, if you've got a time series that was sampled at 1 Hertz, like you couldn't just bootstrap that because, as you're saying, like they're not independent samples. At the other extreme, if you've got a whole bunch of 10-minute statistics, chances are, at least in wind energy, 10-minute statistics will be independent, uncorrelated. So you could bootstrap a bunch of those. So the blocking, in my mind, kind of moves from the one extreme to the other by, like if it were a really long time series, days and days and days, you block in 10 minutes. And now it's kind of like you're pretending I've got 10-minute statistics, as long as you keep those 10-minute chunks together so that you have independence among those blocks.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who knows more might say that that's totally wrong, though. That's just my way that I've explained it to myself.
Yeah, but I think you're right that the idea is each block then would be an independent group of data. So all your blocks are independent because they would contain temporal correlation within the block, but
yeah, and if people are interested, I know there's even I believe a formula to figure out the right block size based on some other knowledge you have of the data.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah,
I'll see if I can find that reference.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
And then maybe from an energy change perspective, I guess one of the ways I think of it is that your statistics might become a little, I guess your variance would be a little higher if you use smaller block sizes here, since you might end up, since we're doing toggling, you might end up with like more hours of the day at high energy times in the toggle off phase versus the toggle on. So you might measure an energy difference just because of the way you resampled. And so by keeping your block sizes to like 24 hours or, the length of a toggle on and a toggle off together, you kind of make sure that you're getting I don't want to say a fairer comparison, but a comparison that has less variance. So you get smaller uncertainty bands as a result of using slightly larger bootstrapping sizes. At least that's what we've seen so far.
Okay. Yeah, that's a nice idea. Yeah, I see what you're saying. And actually, the way we're implementing this, the blocks would not properly account for that because first we divide the data into a baseline data set and a wind farm control data set, and then we'll apply blocks to those data sets separately. So the way we're doing it, yeah, there's no guarantee that a block would include like both of the toggle conditions during the same 24-hour period or whatever block length is being used. So that I think what you're saying is it might be better to apply those blocks before dividing the data into the two control modes or the two toggle modes.
Yeah, that's interesting. How do you filter for toggle, like the advection times at each toggle split before you resample?
Yeah, for this data set, we just removed the first 10 minutes after control mode change. Yeah, just to account for the wake advection and settling of the yaw offsets in the new control mode.
Interesting.
Yeah, so first do that and then split into the data frames for the two control modes.
Thanks for the explanation.
Yeah, thanks for the nice idea. So yeah, there's some papers by Nikolai Newgord from Ørsted, and who's done a lot of estimation of wake losses at offshore wind plants and wake model benchmarking. This is where I first heard about the idea of block bootstrapping. But in their papers, they recommend block sizes of 2 to 5 days, so much longer than I would have initially guessed. And it's possible that block size would, the optimal block size would be different depending on what metric you're trying to quantify, but this was at least a starting point, some recommendations where these block sizes presumably would account for most of the temporal correlation that you would see in the data. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the other method we've implemented called the expected, well, we called it the expected power method, but the report is called the active wake control validation methodology from TNO. So we talked about this a lot. Nasir gave a presentation on this a few years ago, maybe just a couple of years ago, actually. And so we like this method and wanted to implement some components of it in FLASC so we could compare the approaches for estimating the energy uplift. So an overview of how this works: you're still binning the data by reference wind speed and direction, and the report goes into a lot of detail about how to calibrate the wind speeds and directions at your reference turbines. Our method is not quite going into that level of detail. We're just assuming that you have a reference wind speed and direction that are provided to the method. And then instead of using reference turbines, instead of normalizing by the reference power, we're just taking the average power in the average power of the test turbines in each bin and taking the difference between the wake steering control, wind farm control, and baseline control periods. So this metric, we're computing a change in power in each wind condition bin, and that's computed by summing over all of the test turbines, all the turbines we're interested in, and then summing the mean power of that test turbine within a wind condition bin I for the wake steering control period, and then subtracting that same summation over all test turbines of the average power of the turbine during baseline control for that wind condition bin. And so the advantage of summing the mean values rather than summing the turbine powers first and then taking the average is that if there's a timestamp where one of the test turbines is unavailable, we don't need to discard that entire timestamp. We just don't include that timestamp when computing the average power of that particular turbine, but we can still use that data to compute the average power of the other test turbines. So this has some advantages for larger wind farms, larger data sets where we would discard too much data if we required all turbines to be operating normally at each timestamp. And then the total change in energy, similarly calculated by summing over all the wind condition bins, multiplying the frequency of that bin by the change in power, delta P. And then in the numerator, we're just computing the sum of the average wind farm power in each bin to get that percent change due to wind farm control. And then here just illustrating that in this method, if we have an upstream turbine that is derated or operating abnormally, we would not only flag that turbine, but also consider any turbine in its wake that could be affected by its wake to be operating abnormally or invalid as well, because it's not seeing the normal wake effects on the turbine. So that's kind of a pre-processing step before applying the algorithm. So I'm listing some of the equations from this report from TNO. These are essentially just what I showed on the previous slide, so I'll skip over this. And then just listing some of the equations that are used to quantify uncertainty. So again, the difference in this approach is it does not use bootstrapping, but it propagates the standard errors of the power in each wind condition bin during the two control modes, uses a linearized form of the wind farm power or wind farm energy uplift equation to then approximate the standard error or the variance of the estimated change in power or change in energy. So that's the top equation, and it uses the standard error of the power of the wind farm power in each wind condition bin for the two control modes. And those in turn are computed using the equation 4.16, where we're summing over all of the pairs of turbines and then summing the variance of the power in a particular the variance of the power for a particular turbine, and then the covariance between different turbine pairs of their power within that wind condition bin. Yeah, so we have to compute this covariance matrix and then sum all the terms to get the variance of the wind farm power in that bin. And then the bottom equations are just how to compute the variance or the standard error between any pair of turbines. So yeah, this is nice because you just have to compute these equations once, and then you can quantify the uncertainty by propagating the standard errors. There's no need for the more computationally expensive bootstrapping. And when we were implementing this, and we were talking to Stoyan, the author of this report, and realized that there can be some cases where there's not enough data to compute the covariance between the power in for different turbines within a particular bin. For example, we don't require that all the turbines are operating normally at the same time in our data. So we could have cases where a pair of turbines, we have several samples for each of those turbines, but we don't have very many samples overlapping when both of the turbines are operating normally at the same time. And in that case, we might only have one sample or no overlapping samples to compute a covariance term. I think that would be rare, but it could happen, especially in less common wind condition bins. So we used three options for computing these covariance terms when quantifying uncertainty. One is to just assume the covariance is 0 for different turbine pairs and only use the variance of the power for particular turbines. Then we have a variance option where we just replace all the covariances with the product of the variances of the individual turbines. So assuming that the correlation between the turbine's power would be 1. And then kind of the method I've normally been using is, we call that the covariance option, where when possible, we compute the covariance between a pair of turbines in a particular wind condition bin. But if there's not enough data, then we use the product of the variances of the individual turbines. And so if we use the covariance, that's usually the middle level of uncertainty that gets quantified. Variance, then that ends up with the highest uncertainty. And if we zero out all the covariance terms, that probably underestimates the actual uncertainty. Yeah, so in this method as it's implemented in FLASC, you can select those different options to handle when there's not enough data in a particular bin. So just to compare these methods, this is just my opinion. So yeah, other people might have other thoughts, but the power ratio method, by normalizing by the power of the reference turbines, that's nice because it can help control for atmospheric conditions and other factors besides the control mode that could impact the power of those test turbines. So maybe there's higher wind shear during some samples than other samples, or higher turbulence. And if we normalize the power of the test turbines by the reference power, then that can kind of help cancel out that impact of turbulence or shear or other conditions besides control. So we can just isolate the impact of wind farm control on the power production, or on the change of power production. And then since it's we're using bootstrapping, the method does not require any assumptions about the distribution of the underlying data. And then for the expected power, or TNO method, some advantages are we do not require reference turbines for power. So we don't need to have a set of reference turbines that's always operating normally to use for normalizing the power. It does not require all of the test turbines to be operating normally at each timestamp, which significantly increases the data availability for large wind farms. And then the UQ method is very computationally efficient compared to bootstrapping. Okay, so realize I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go quickly through these last slides. So we implemented these two methods in the FLASC software. This is open source software on GitHub. Stands for Flores-based analysis of SCADA data. And it's a toolbox used for analyzing wake interactions using SCADA data that's been collected. And then those can be compared with model predictions from Flores. And then we have these methods for evaluating wind farm control performance using SCADA data, and also comparing that to Flores predictions. So there's an examples folder in the repo called example SMARTEOLE, and this uses that open data set from the SMARTEOLE experiment. Just looking at, yeah, we have this sequence of notebooks you can run, and yeah, so notebook 2 that shows how to download this data set from Zenodo and format it. And then notebook 3 filters the data to identify periods when the turbines are operating normally, or when they're curtailed or derated or shut down. Notebook 4 applies northing calibration, so calibrates the wind direction to true north, because we do want a reliable reference wind direction, and there could be biases or calibration that's needed in the nacelle position of the turbines. And then I just highlighted notebook 6 and 10. They show how to compute the total uplift, or the total change in energy for this data with wake steering control, using the power ratio method in notebook 6, and then the TNO method, which we're calling expected power, in notebook 10. And so to run this, we first have our data frame of SCADA data, and we have to assign a reference wind direction, a reference wind speed, and a power reference. We only need the power reference for the power ratio method, not for the expected power method. And these are just using values that were pre-computed in the SMARTEOLE data set, but there are other approaches for taking the average of the unwaked turbines, using that as your reference wind direction and wind speed. Then we split this into a baseline and a control data frame by selecting for when the control mode is baseline or controlled. And then we create an analysis input object, which contains our baseline and controlled data frames. We label them as baseline and controlled. And then here we can specify the number of blocks to divide the data into for block bootstrapping. I think I will skip over this, but there are a lot of options you can provide when computing the total uplift using the power ratio or total uplift using expected power. I'll just highlight, for test turbines, we're indicating which turbines we want to include to compute the total change in energy for, and that's indices 4 and 5, our downstream, and then our upstream wake steering turbine. We can specify the wind direction and wind speed step size, and then the bin edges that are used, and N is the number of bootstrap iterations, and then percentiles. So we can, return uncertainty as the 95th percentile, or sorry, the 95% confidence interval, or any value, any confidence interval we want by specifying these percentiles. All right, then in these example notebooks, we can just visualize the change in energy for different wind direction bins. We can also do this for wind speed bins. So this is useful for visualizing, are we seeing increases in energy where we would expect them to be? And in this case, we are, because between 210 and 220 degrees is kind of where the peak of the yaw offsets are. And so for the combined turbines, we do see an increase in energy there. On the right, for the expected power method, this is also comparing to Flores predictions. And then we can see the number of points we have in each wind speed and wind direction bin, which can be useful for, looking at how well the data is distributed. Okay, so really, most of the results I wanted to show are in these last two slides. And there's a lot going on here, but I'm looking at the sensitivity in the total change in energy from wake steering, the sensitivity to the bin size of wind speed, and the specific bin edges for the wind speed bins. So the left column, this is the results using the power ratio method, and the right is the expected power method, or the TNO approach. And the top plot, this is the change in energy for 4 different bin sizes. And the shaded areas, this is the confidence interval. And it's plotted against the lower bin edge. So basically where we start, where we separate two bins. So 0 means that our bins would start, like right at 0 meters per second. And then they're expressed as a fraction of the bin size. So 0.5 means we would start, if our bin size is 1 meter per second, the bin edges would be at 0.5 meters per second, 1.5, etc. So really just looking at the sensitivity for changing exactly how we define the wind speed bins. And we could have done this for wind direction as well, but we just saw some interesting trends with wind speed, so looked into that in more detail. Okay, so the bottom row, then the bottom plot, this is just comparing the confidence intervals for the different wind speed bin sizes and bin edge positions. So one thing we noticed here is with the power ratio method, that total change in energy it's somewhat sensitive to the bin size, but all the total change in energy, they're all pretty similar, a little over 0.5%, regardless of where the bin edges are located and what the bin size is. And for the expected power method, there's a lot more variation. So if we select different bin sizes and bin edge positions, then the estimated increase in energy could vary from 0 to about 0.6. And then even if you've identified a particular bin size you want to use, there's a lot of sensitivity to that bin edge position, especially for the larger bin sizes. And our hypothesis is that the power ratio method, since we're normalizing by the power of the reference turbines, then it's not as, then when we bin the data, it's not quite as sensitive to how much, what variety of wind conditions are represented in that bin, because we're already normalizing by the power of reference turbines that are experiencing similar wind conditions. Whereas the expected power method, say for the highest bin size we considered of 1 meter per second, the power can change quite a bit within a 1 meter per second bin. So, that might be including too much variation within that wind speed bin, and that could potentially be more of an issue for smaller data sets where we wouldn't have as much data in each wind speed, wind direction bin. And then looking at the confidence intervals on the lower right plot with the expected power method, for the smallest bin size considered and the highest bin size, so 0.125 meters per second or 1 meter per second, the uncertainty is higher. It's a little bit higher. They're all very similar, 0.9 to 0.95 for the confidence interval, but there is more uncertainty, suggesting that we don't want the wind speed bins to be too small or too big. So we want to have enough data in each bin, but not too much that a bin just includes too many different wind conditions. All right. And then so this slide now, I think, I'm just selecting a wind speed bin of 0.5 meter per second, a bin edge of 0, and 0.5 meter per second seems to be a pretty good balance for the bin size for this data set that we analyzed. So now this is looking at bootstrapping and looking at the sensitivity of the results to different block sizes for block bootstrapping. And comparing results for the power ratio method and the expected power method. For expected power, I talked about how we propagate the standard errors, and we don't need to do bootstrapping, but we also have an option to apply bootstrapping to quantify uncertainty if we want to do that, just for comparison. So I did that, and compared a bunch of different block sizes. So you'll notice on the far left, there's a block size of 1, and that would just be the same as not applying any block bootstrapping, just standard bootstrapping. Then as we increase that size, the confidence interval actually increases. So this matches what kind of the recommendations from the papers by Nikolai from Ørsted, that if you don't apply block bootstrapping and account for that temporal correlation, you could potentially underestimate the uncertainty in the metric that's being computed. And so, somewhere around a block size of 100 samples, then we start to reach a more or less, constant confidence interval. And it's hard to tell if there's an advantage of increasing the block size even more. So for the extreme block size shown here, we really only end up with 2 or 3 blocks in our data. So that's probably not a good representation of the variability from bootstrapping. So I would say there's some balance, maybe around 100 samples, 200, or a block size of 100 or 200 might be a good level of defining the blocks for bootstrapping for this data set. Was also thought it was interesting that the confidence intervals are very similar for the two methods. So that was just kind of reassuring that using these two approaches, one normalizes by reference power, the other doesn't. We get similar uncertainty, although I wasn't expecting that. And yeah, the other thing to point out is the uncertainty that's quantified with the expected power method just by propagating the standard errors. We get something around 0.9, which is pretty much identical to the uncertainty we estimate from bootstrapping with a block size of one sample. So just standard bootstrapping. Yeah, so I'll wrap up here. We're a couple minutes over. The main conclusions that I found from those last two slides are when we use the power ratio method, actually did estimate a slightly higher energy gain, maybe around 0.55% rather than 0.4% for the expected power method. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty in those estimates. And then the power ratio method appears to be less sensitive to the wind speed, bin size, and the bin edges, likely because of the normalization by a reference power. And then the uncertainty from the propagation of standard errors is similar to the uncertainty with standard bootstrapping. So, and it's a lot more computationally efficient. So it, might just be better to use the propagation of standard errors rather than bootstrapping. But these results suggest that uncertainty might be underestimated using standard bootstrapping, and it is important to use the block bootstrapping, which gives a higher uncertainty estimate. All right, so that's all I have. Thanks for sticking around, and I'm happy to continue discussing if anybody has any comments or questions on that. I know there's a lot of information in the last couple slides especially. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eric. I think that was a great presentation. Do you mind if I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go for it.
So you say that the uncertainty is similar, but I didn't quite understand what was the option that you included for the uncertainty with the TNO method. Was it with no variances? Was it replacing the covariance by in all entries with the variances? What was the choice for that?
Yeah, I used the what we called the covariance option. So if there are at least two samples in of overlapping data for a turbine pair in a given bin, then you compute the covariance. If there's not enough data, then you just use the product of the variances.
Okay, so it's kind of the most conservative, you could say.
Yeah, I think the most conservative would be just using the product of the variances for all turbine pairs, because that you'd get the highest magnitude of the, that covariance term.
Okay.
But this is the approach that's closest to what's described in the report. So we try to follow that as closely as possible, except when there's not enough data to compute covariance.
Thanks. Did you actually have the final 95% confidence interval on the final AEP or on the weighted uplift instead of per bin? Did you reach that figure?
Yeah, so this plot on the right, this is showing, this is the change in energy over that wind direction sector, 195 to 241 degrees, wind speeds from 4 to 17 meters per second. So this is the confidence interval for that total change in energy over over that range of wind conditions. And the 95% confidence interval was about 0.95 percentage points.
Okay, but you never aggregated it over all wind directions because that was the only activation range, right? Okay, all right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so that's not the same as an AEP gain.
Yeah, okay. Super, thanks. Very curious to read the paper if there is one.
Yeah, we'll see. Right now, this was just looking at some different parameter choices in FLASC and seeing how they affect the results. So no paper, but yeah, hopefully we can publish something on this later. All right. Any other questions or comments? Brian, I saw you had your hand raised. I don't know if you still had something. No worries.
Yeah,
if not.
it was a little off topic, but maybe I can throw it out there anyway. I guess one thing I think of whenever I'm working with these methods is two additional sources of uncertainty. One, I guess, if you think about, you've got a power measured at each reference and test turbine. There's like an infinite number of ways, distributions of power at each of those turbines that can average to the same values. And so there's some uncertainty, as I guess, related to what bin a sample belongs to. And I was just curious if you had seen anyone trying to address that yet.
I don't know if I quite follow that question. So you're talking about like how you would or how you determine the reference wind speed or direction for binning a particular timestamp? Or
I think the methods are pretty clear on a lot of that, but when you start thinking about like advection times and things, you know, you measure a wind speed that you're going to use as your binning variable essentially. But you know, if a turbine's deep in the farm, maybe the power that it's measuring was generated at a wind speed that was 10 minutes in the past, not the one that you're currently binning on, and things like that.
right.
So I feel like there's still like some certain sources of uncertainty that, you know, I certainly am not 100% sure how to address at the moment. But yeah, I was just curious if there was any work in that direction as well. Trying to come up with like a good representation. I know that the average wind speeds and directions are good low dimensional representations of the wind field at the time, but you know, certainly not as high resolution as one might want.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I haven't really thought too much about that, but yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I mean, maybe you could even have different reference wind speeds at different locations on the wind farm if it's a really large wind farm, rather than using the average of the reference turbines, or maybe the wind speed bin you group data into could be based on or could account for that advection time. So you're not just assigning the same wind speed to all turbines at a given timestamp.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, don't want
to
distract too much. Thanks for sticking around a little extra.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Appreciate you staying a few minutes over, and yeah, we'll talk soon at one of the next monthly meetings. So thank you for joining, and have a good rest of your day.